At the White House today, President Reagan signed the major new anti-drug law, a law that stiffens the penalties for federal drug crimes and provides almost $2 billion for increased drug enforcement and education. At the bill signing ceremony, Mr. Reagan said today, "This marks a major victory in our crusade against drugs. It is a crusade that Nancy Reagan has made her personal cause." Mr. Reagan said, "Our goal is nothing less than a drug-free generation."
Anti-Drug Abuse Act, signed by President Reagan in 1986, it created a huge disparity between how harsh your sentence would be if you got caught with crack cocaine versus getting caught with powdered cocaine. If you got caught with crack, you got a much stiffer sentence. It was a 100-to-1 disparity. It also imposed mandatory minimum sentences, which tied judges' hands. Judges had no choice but to put people away for years if they were caught with crack, even if they didn't necessarily think that the person deserved 10 or 20 years behind bars. And laws like that had a huge material impact, not just on individual lives and individual communities, but on the whole country. This charts the annual growth of the prison population from 1925 to 1986, the year that President Reagan signed that landmark anti-drug bill. This is what happened to the prison population after 1986. In the last 3 decades, we've increased the population of people we keep in prison by 500%. Compared to the world, in terms of the proportion of our citizens that we lock up, right now we're number one. Number two, you'll see well behind us there, is Rwanda. This huge population of the prison, the huge explosion of the prison population in this country, to a point where we are completely out of keeping with the rest of the world, except for maybe Rwanda trying to keep up. That eventually made it clear that something had to change. And that's in part because it became clear for anybody who wanted to look at the facts that our exploding prison population wasn't because of something that was happening organically in this country. It wasn't all about the crime rate. It was because of policy and politics. It was because of tough on crime, conservative politics fueled by media hysteria. That is how we built ourselves into this problem, where a full third of the entire budget for our whole Justice Department goes to paying to keep people in prison. Interestingly, though, although it was conservative politics that drove us to where we are today, there is today a strand of conservative politics that wants to get us out of this problem, that wants to reform the justice system in a way that'll leave less people in prison. At the big CPAC conference this year, Rick Perry and Jeb Bush and Newt Gingrich and Rand Paul all talked about the small government virtues of shrinking the prison population, reforming the justice system to let especially nonviolent offenders, especially drug offenders, out of prison, thereby saving money and reducing the size of government. I don't know if we would have guessed back in the bad old days of the 80s and 90s that prison reform would one day emerge as a potential area of bipartisan consensus, but it may have. In 2010, President Obama signed the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the disparities in sentencing between crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine. It reduced them from the Reagan-era 100-to-1 to something more like 18-to-1. It also got rid of some of the more onerous mandatory minimum sentences that were imposed by the Reagan drug bill in 1986. But that 2010 law that President Obama signed, it wasn't retroactive. It didn't help anybody who'd already been sentenced under those old laws. Last year, President Obama commuted the sentences of 8 people who'd served more than a decade in prison for crimes that would have resulted in a far lighter sentence today if they'd been sentenced under today's laws. They were all drug offenders who had spent years behind bars. 8 people. Well, today, building on that in a big way. Today, a huge development in our nation's policy on these issues. The Deputy Attorney General today announced that the Justice Department's putting out a broad call to federal prisoners all over the country, asking them that if they are in a similar situation to those 8 people whose sentences were commuted last year, would they apply for clemency? Well, this afternoon, Congressman Bob Goodlatte of Virginia said that today's announcement proves that President Obama has a, quote, blatant disregard for our nation's laws. Should we see him as a symbol that Republicans are going to go that route on this, that they're going to revive the tough-on-crime politics of the 80s and 90s? Or is there going to be a split in the Republican Party on this issue? Is this going to be the tough-on-crime wing, the old-school guys versus the new-school guys who are actually trying to argue about this as a small government issue? This is a legitimately unanswered open question in our politics, and that almost never happens.
What you're going to see, I think, is a lot of Republicans that might be willing to support this under normal circumstances are going to look at this, and it's 2014. They're trying to take over the Senate. They're trying to keep control of the House. They're trying to set up a 2016 fight. And what they've hit on as a party is this argument of you can't trust Obama.
Yeah.
That's why they're fighting against immigration reform. They point to the Obamacare changes. They point to some of the other kinds of things he's done, NSA, and say you can't trust him. And this really does sort of fall within that rubric.
Just because it's executive action.
Just because it's executive action. And I think you're going to see people who say, I agree with the policy. He should not be doing this on his own. This should be stopped until Congress can act. I think you're going to see a lot of that on the right, which is, for them, it puts them in a sort of a tough spot. But politics right now rules everything in Washington. And Republicans are going to be under enormous pressure to toe this line, I think. And it's going to be hard for them to get out from underneath.
And what's going to be fascinating, though, is that there isn't an action item here for Congress. Yeah, the Justice Department and the White House are saying, we'd love it if you guys did this congressionally, but you're not acting on it, and so we're going ahead. They're going to go ahead, and this is going to happen regardless of what Congress does. I think the thing to watch is whether they shut up about it, pretend like it doesn't have any political consequences at all, or whether they try to crusade.
That may be the best hope for folks who find themselves in this situation, is that they just sort of stay quiet on it.
It's amazing. It's actual policy being made on a thing that we used to think was completely intractable, and everybody's like, shh.